The English spelling system is pretty messed up.
Let's talk about it. What's up, guys, and welcome back to Waiguo Friends English. Today we're going to talk about some tricky problem words that are honestly just examples of how terrible the English language can be sometimes. As you probably very well know, what English has done through the years is basically when it reaches another language, it basically just consumes a lot of the vocabulary that's in that word. We don't have any words for the things that are in that native culture, and so we just take in the words. And a lot of times we try to keep the spellings in those words. So if we have a French word that comes assimilated into English, we largely keep the spelling for those words, which means that not only is the spelling weird, but also the pronunciation for that word is also really strange.
A quick search for a video on how English has evolved and how its spelling system has evolved, you're going to find like there were conquerors, like the Norman conquest, that brought thousands and thousands of French words into the language. We have a lot of Germanic words, we have a lot of Latin things. There was a time where scholars decided to try to make English seem less like a common language and more scholarly, so they started to just put silent Latin letters in, like in the word det or island, for example. That's where our C's really got messed up. Some of them were ch, some of them were k, and some of them were s. English is a really messed up system when it comes to spelling and pronunciation. So many other languages, and I was actually surprised when I started learning other languages that their spelling systems are actually accurate. How do you spell this word? And they'll just like pronounce the word, and you're like, oh wow, that's not a problem for you guys. And that's why we have spelling bees.
I remember I was traveling one time and I was trying to figure out how a person spelled this word. Even the sounds that they give the name of the letters were the sounds that they make. So like B is how we say the letter B, but how do you say this letter? And they would say B, because that's how you say it. B. That's the name of the B letter. It's B. And I was like, oh my goodness. Yeah. In English, we have different names even for the letters themselves. B, C, D.
One of the things that so many English language learners struggle with is spelling. And that is totally understandable, totally get it. And I'm sorry, that is just an uphill battle. But the next thing is going to be pronunciation, because they see the word. If somebody has spent so much time learning to spell the word, sometimes they assume you can pronounce the word similarly to the way that it is spelled. For example, let's just take that OU. You have through, you have though, you have bow, you have rough, you have cough, and that's not all of them. There's other ways to pronounce that. And part of it is because they come from different language origins. Some of it's just because they've just shifted over time. We've had vowel shifts. But even then, not everybody within the continental US actually pronounces them the same. We have a line where the vowels are pronounced differently. They're higher, closer to Canada than they are in the South. It's fascinating. We love the pronunciation map. We love all the pronunciation differences, but it also makes it exceedingly difficult for English language learners. So here's a list of words that we just pronounce so wrong from the pronunciation, and they're quite common words, so these are just kind of a heads up to you of how to pronounce them.
So the first word is an easy word. You would think that you probably pronounce this word very correctly all the time, but when you look at it, it's surprisingly weird. It's the word question. We don't say question.
Question.
We don't say that. That T-I-O-N on a lot of other words actually pronounces it as like a shun sound. So we should say question. But that's not what we do. We actually turn that last part of the word into a CH sound. Question.
And we kind of put like a T in there. Question. So almost a CH too sometimes. And you can hear, even Americans will vary our pronunciation sometimes depending on who we're around. And so sometimes it just comes out question. That's a CH. We jack this word up quite a bit. The next one is past or past. We have a whole video on words like this, where that ED pronunciation is sometimes a T, sometimes it's ED, sometimes it's just a T. You guys can check that out, but this is an example of that. Past and past.
I always pronounce them the same.
It's mostly the same in informal conversation. Now, as English teachers, we've learned to distinguish that when we're speaking with a student to make it clear what we're meaning. But if we go out into normal life, nobody makes a distinguishing mark here.
So the next word is controversial because it has two pronunciations. You could say niche or niche. Now, I actually am in favor of saying niche just because it comes from French, Latin originally, but it's a CH. So ideally we should say niche. So when people say niche, why? Because it is also acceptable.
The next word is business. If you notice it in spelling, there's an I in there that makes it look like busyness, but it's not busyness, even though businesses keep you quite busy. That's how I remember to include that I, even though I don't actually pronounce it that way. I say business, business, no I in the middle.
Business.
So that one's, don't forget that I.
The next one is candidate.
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 Even just between us two, you have different set of Englishes. If you want to use the fancy term, these are called idiosyncrasies, which just means that my English is a little bit different from her English. So I say candidate.
This is what actually I hear the most often. Candidate is something that I hear quite a bit, but mostly from people who have been trained to speak like professionally. So newscasters, people who are doing speeches, people who are going into politics, something like this. But to be fair, like the way that I'm saying it's closer to how it's spelled. But this is what you hear. Candidate, candidate, or candidate. This is how most people do say it around here. And in different places that we've heard, different people that we've heard, their interviews from around the States or different friends from around the country, they all pronounce it more like what Josh is saying.
The next term is actually a term that I hate with a deep part of my soul. It's the word February.
Because it has an R in there. February.
February.
How long did you misspell this word
A
in
lot.
school?
A lot. 10th grade.
But I don't know anybody who says February on purpose. Like February in all seriousness. Most people, if they say that, they're saying it out loud to goof off or be silly. It's kind of like our next word, Wednesday, is spelled Wednesday instead. And some accents around the world, they actually say Wednesday. But here in the States, most of us say Wednesday. And so when I hear somebody say Wednesday, or if I hear February here in the States, I know that they're mostly joking. They're just being silly to make up a point. Somebody might say, well, that's not how it's spelled. And then they win because it was an easy pickings for a joke. Somebody who didn't realize all their life that had the silent letter in there.
I specifically remember when I was in high school, when I was in my Spanish class, and we were talking about pronunciation for Spanish in that class, my teacher, who is a native Mexican, he hated the word February. He couldn't even say it right. As an adult, as a 40-something adult trying to teach the Spanish class, he was trying to teach us the Spanish word for February. And he's like, I'm not going to say the word because I can't say it. And of course we made him say it, and he really couldn't say it. It was a challenging word.
It is a challenging word. The next word is mischievous.
Ooh.
But you will hear so many Americans say
mischievous.
So many of us will say mischievous instead, but it's mischievous. Is how it is actually supposed to be pronounced.
This one's surprising because we changed that word so much. Like we changed where the stress is, we changed the vowels completely at the end. Like it is surprising that this word has changed so much from mischievous to mischievous. That's wild.
It's fascinating. But as you see this word pop up in children's books or in different places, people telling jokes or people commenting on their kids, which one's the most mischievous, they'll do that. They'll slip into that mischievous. But mischievous is the way it's supposed to be. But we pronounce it so wrong all the time.
The next one, which is quite difficult, is jewelry.
That's a hard pronunciation. Why do we take out the extra vowel? It's supposed to be jewelry.
Jewelry.
Which might make it a little bit easier to go from that W, because what we did is we shortened it in syllables. We shortened it to make it easier to say, probably, but it's not easier if you're not an English speaker because that's a W-L-R-Y sound. That's a tight consonant cluster. It's difficult.
And you'll notice this as you get to other words too, where when we start pushing consonant sounds together, not only obviously does the word become more difficult to say, but we have to do something with our mouths in order to make that possible. A lot of times we diminish that. I think of the primary example is the word worlds. That's an R-L-D-S all together. All of those are their own consonants. So to put them all together is incredibly difficult. But it's something that you kind of have to get used to, especially if your first language doesn't have that element of consonant clusters.
You just did one. You said your instead of your.
Especially if your first language, your
Not every accent will do this, but a lot of them here in the American South will say your instead of your.
You're right.
The next one is kernel.
Yeah.
Which has nothing to do with R in it, but we say it with kernel. We say it with an R, but it's colonel, Colonel is how it's spelled, but we say colonel.
No.
I can blame the British for this. That's where we got it from.
No clue. The next one is one that in America we tend to not use very much just because I think it's a little weird. I think it looks weird. I think it's spelled weird. It's queue, as in the line in order to wait. Please wait in the queue. We'll probably just say please wait in the line or line up or something like that.
Yes.
We tend to avoid actually saying queue very much in American English.
It's more of a British term for sure, but it is something that I'm seeing more and more. Like over the years, I'm hearing it more and more in the US. People saying like queue up, for example. I've heard that a couple of times. I'm like, wait. And I don't know if it's because these people have traveled abroad and they've seen it a lot, or they watch a lot of British TV shows or something. I don't know where it's coming from, but typically you're not going to hear like an announcement in like a train station or bus station or something. You're not going to hear them say queue up or stand in the queues. You're not going to hear that. You're going to say here, stand in the lines or line up.
Another one that you guys might already be familiar with is aisle. Amber already hinted at this word before in an earlier part of this video where she said island. It's the same thing with aisle, except that it's even more short and even more confusing because there's not a whole lot there.
Right.
Aisle.
I just thought of the other word, that like aisles in a store. A-I-S-L-E. And we still say aisle.
There's still no S sound.
Yep, not at all. Just all those great scholars trying to make English more like Latin. I appreciate you guys so much. The last word we have for you today is quinoa. And quinoa has become a bit more popular here lately in the United States. And we're starting to see it more and more. Like you're starting to see it in things like in certain restaurants as one of the ingredients for something. But Josh just learned that it was quinoa.
I have no words. I have no words to share with you guys.
What were you saying before?
Quinoa.
Quinoa. That's what we would say. If we weren't familiar with this term, that is probably how we would say it is quinoa. But quinoa is what you're supposed to say.
I'm flabbergasted.
But it's coming to English through Spanish, which Spanish got it from another language before that. So its pronunciation, yes, is very different than its spelling.
No words. No words. I'm so sorry. That's the only thing I can say.
Guys, for you, the main point of this video is that we don't pronounce things at all like the spelling system. Most of you already know that by this point, but here are some really common words, especially as an advanced speaker, that you'll run into, that you'll hear people say, and this is just the different ways that we do it. In different accents, we'll do it a little bit differently as well. So you may hear Americans making mistakes left and right with pronunciation or adding embellishments to the way that they pronounce things, like Wednesday on purpose. Language is so complex and we love it. All this difficulty gives so much color to the language and it makes it so unique. But at the same time, it is exceedingly difficult for those of you who are studying it.
Last thing I will say, it does really differentiate how native your English is. So for example, if a person even here, with the distinction between the word niche and niche, if a person is saying niche, they know the word, but they're reading the word out loud, as opposed to a person saying niche, just having that two different pronunciations really does separate people. And to say, I think this is how it's spelled, or I think this is how it's spelled. With the example of quinoa or quinoa, if you look at it, and you pronounce it how I thought it was pronounced my whole life. And if you pronounce it like that, then you know, as the listener, that that person doesn't know actually how to spell that word. They haven't looked it up, they haven't heard it spoken by a native speaker.
Or they do know how it's spelled, and they're just pronouncing it the way they've always spelled it out in their head. You know what I mean? For me, and this is a little bit of background about me, I was a homeschooled student for many years in my childhood. Not all of them, but for many years. And so I learned mostly from reading. I didn't have a teacher stand up in front and tell me how to pronounce words or how to spell words. I learned spelling by reading a lot. I read a lot, guys. But what happened is my inner voice would pronounce those words. It would sound out the words I was reading based off of what it was spelled as. And so this is something that's been a constant joke for us. I've worked through most of that by now, but in university, I had some problems. I could spell just fine. I knew those words and I was able to use them really well in writing, but sometimes when I spoke, I said things the way they were spelled, not necessarily how they were actually pronounced, because I wasn't surrounded by a ton of people speaking those words.
A prime example was participle, but she would say participle.
Yes, because it's spelled participle. But yes, it was participle is how people say it here. And so I would get picked on so much for that in a joking way. It was people just being like, wow, you are an enigma. You're walking around like speaking like English is meant to be spoken as.
Like it's actually spelled.
Not always though. Obviously common words, things that you would hear on TV, I would say those as everybody else did. But There were some words that were just not commonly spoken outside of school. I didn't hear them, so I said them the way that I read them. I can relate a little bit.
All right, guys, thank you so much for sticking with us on this video. It was different. It's a different kind of video. If you like this kind of video, let us know in the comments below and we can find some more ridiculous words in order for you to be able to practice that pronunciation.
We can talk about more ways English is very broken.
Fact.
All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.
Bye.